The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 1,000th time. 23 years he had served the crown, standing guard through rain and shine, witnessing history unfold before his very eyes. His weathered hands, steady as stone, had saluted countless dignitaries, but today felt different. There was an electricity in the air that made his chest tight with unease. James had been just 19 when he first donned the iconic bearskin hat and scarlet uniform. Fresh-faced and eager, he had sworn an oath to protect the royal family with his life. Over the decades, he had become more than just a guard. He was a silent witness to the monarchy's most intimate moments. He had seen the Queen's radiant smile during Jubilee celebrations, observed her quiet tears during times of national tragedy, and stood motionless as she conducted affairs of state with grace and dignity that commanded respect from world leaders. The Queen had always acknowledged him with the slightest nod, a gesture so subtle that others might miss it entirely. But James never did. In those brief moments, he felt the weight of her trust, the responsibility that came with being her protector. She represented everything he believed in: duty, honor, and service above self. The Queen's Medal of Honor, which she wore on special occasions, had become a symbol of these values to James. It was a reminder of the sacrifices made by countless men and women who had served their country with distinction. This particular morning, James noticed unusual activity within the palace walls. Staff members hurried past with hushed conversations, their faces bearing expressions of concern mixed with curiosity. Something significant was happening, and the veteran guard's instincts told him it involved the royal household's recent changes. Since the Queen's passing, the dynamics within the palace had shifted dramatically. New protocols, new faces, and new decisions that sometimes left longtime staff members feeling displaced and uncertain about their future. As James took his position at the main entrance, he reflected on the conversations he had overheard in recent weeks. Palace staff, people he had worked alongside for years, spoke in worried whispers about changes being implemented throughout the royal residences. Traditional practices that had been maintained for generations were suddenly being questioned or altered entirely. The guard had always prided himself on remaining neutral, focusing solely on his duty to protect rather than judge. But lately he found himself struggling to maintain that emotional distance as he witnessed decisions that seemed to contradict everything the late Queen had stood for. The crisp, autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as James watched a black sedan pull up to the palace gates. Through the tinted windows, he could make out familiar silhouettes. His training kicked in automatically, his posture straightening as he prepared to fulfill his ceremonial role. Yet beneath the surface of his professional composure, a growing sense of unease churned in his stomach. He had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded significant royal events, and today those signs were everywhere. James remembered the day he had first seen the Queen's Medal of Honor up close. It was during a private ceremony honoring veterans, and she had worn it with such reverence that it seemed to glow against her navy dress. The intricate design told a story of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the nation. She had explained to the assembled guests that the medal represented not just personal achievement, but the collective spirit of all those who had served. Her words had resonated deeply with James, reinforcing his own sense of purpose and dedication to his role as guardian of the crown. The palace bells chimed 11 o'clock, their melodious tones echoing across the grounds like a call to attention. James knew that within the next hour, events would unfold that would test his resolve in ways he had never imagined. His years of service had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. The weight of his rifle felt heavier than usual as he stood at attention, his eyes scanning the horizon while his mind wrestled with a growing sense of foreboding. As the minutes ticked by, James found himself thinking about his own family's military history. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and now he carried on the tradition of service in his own way. The concept of honor wasn't just a word to him. It was a living, breathing principle that guided every aspect of his life. He had always believed that those in positions of power, especially within the royal household, understood and respected this same principle. Today, that belief would be put to the ultimate test. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path brought James back to the present moment. His training had taught him to remain focused regardless of his personal thoughts or feelings. But as he prepared to witness what was about to unfold, he felt a tremor of emotion that he struggled to suppress. 23 years of unwavering loyalty had led to this moment, and James Mitchell, Sergeant of the Royal Guard, was about to discover just how far his patience could be pushed before it finally broke. The heavy oak doors of the palace opened with their familiar creak, and James watched as Camilla emerged, flanked by 2 personal assistants and a gentleman he didn't recognize. Her expression was animated, almost excited, as she gestured toward a small velvet box that one of her assistants carried with obvious care. James's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the distinctive burgundy color of the royal jewelry cases used for the most precious items in the crown's collection. From his position, James could see that Camilla was dressed more casually than usual, wearing a cream-colored blazer and pearls that caught the morning light. Her demeanor suggested this was not an official royal engagement, but rather something more personal. The unknown gentleman appeared to be in his 50s, well-dressed but not in the formal attire typically required for official palace business. His easy familiarity with Camilla and the casual way he handled the precious box immediately set off alarm bells in James's mind. As the group moved toward the garden area, James strained to hear their conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. Years of guard duty had sharpened his ability to gather information while maintaining his stoic appearance. What he heard made his blood run cold. Camilla was discussing the contents of the velvet box with an enthusiasm that seemed inappropriate, given the solemnity usually associated with the Queen's personal effects. She mentioned something about finding the perfect home for items that needed to be appreciated rather than stored away. The gentleman, who introduced himself as Marcus Whitfield from Whitfield Auction House, examined the box with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to handling valuable items. James felt his jaw clench involuntarily as he realized what was transpiring before his eyes. This wasn't an official ceremony or a formal transfer of royal artifacts to a museum. This appeared to be a private transaction involving items that belonged to the late Queen's personal collection. James had been present during many official ceremonies where the Queen's possessions were formally transferred or donated to institutions. Those events were always conducted with tremendous ceremony, proper documentation, and the presence of multiple witnesses from the royal household. What he was observing now bore none of those hallmarks of official protocol. Instead, it felt secretive, almost furtive, as if the participants were deliberately avoiding the normal channels of royal administration. The velvet box was opened carefully, and James caught a glimpse of the familiar gleam of precious metal. His heart sank as he recognized the distinctive design of the Queen's Medal of Honor, the very same medal he had seen her wear with such pride and reverence. The sight of it being handled so casually, discussed as if it were merely another valuable object to be disposed of, filled him with a rage that he struggled to contain behind his professional facade. Marcus Whitfield held the medal up to the light, examining it through a small jeweler's loupe that he produced from his pocket. He nodded approvingly as he discussed its provenance and potential value with Camilla. The conversation turned to market conditions for royal memorabilia and the growing interest among private collectors for authentic pieces with documented histories. James felt physically ill as he listened to them reduce the Queen's most treasured possession to mere commodity, to be sold to the highest bidder. Camilla's voice carried clearly across the courtyard as she explained that she believed the medal would be better appreciated by someone who would display it prominently rather than having it locked away in storage. She spoke about the importance of these items, finding their way to people who would truly value them, but her words rang hollow to James. He knew the Queen's wishes regarding her personal effects, and he was certain that selling her Medal of Honor to a private collector was not among them. The transaction proceeded with business-like efficiency that made James's stomach turn. Papers were produced and signed, and Marcus Whitfield produced an envelope that he discreetly handed to Camilla. The entire exchange took less than 15 minutes, but to James it felt like an eternity. He watched in stunned silence as the medal that had represented everything noble about the monarchy was reduced to a simple business transaction, conducted in the shadows of the very palace where the Queen had devoted her life to serving her people. As the group prepared to leave, James noticed other items being discussed for future transactions. Marcus Whitfield made notes in a small leather portfolio, and James overheard mentions of jewelry, personal photographs, and other mementos that held deep sentimental value. It became clear that this was not an isolated incident but part of a larger, systematic disposal of the Queen's personal effects without regard for their historical or emotional significance. The realization that this might be just the beginning filled James with a despair he had never experienced in his years of service. He had always believed that his role was to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the integrity of the institution they represented. Now he was witnessing what felt like a betrayal of everything the crown stood for, and his position required him to remain silent and motionless while it happened before his eyes. As Camilla and her companions disappeared back into the palace, James remained at his post, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. The weight of his knowledge felt crushing, and for the first time in his career, he questioned whether his oath of silence extended to protecting actions that he believed betrayed the very institution he had sworn to serve. The afternoon stretched ahead of him like an endless trial, each minute bringing new doubts about his duty and his conscience. The hours following the transaction passed like a nightmare from which James could not wake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of the Queen's Medal of Honor being examined like a piece of merchandise, its sacred meaning reduced to nothing more than market value. His hands trembled slightly as he maintained his position, a tremor that would have been imperceptible to casual observers but felt like an earthquake to someone trained in absolute stillness. As evening approached, James found himself remembering a conversation he had overheard between the Queen and a young page several years earlier. The boy had accidentally dropped a simple silver letter opener that belonged to the Queen's personal collection, and he had been mortified by his clumsiness. Rather than expressing anger, the Queen had gently explained that every item in her possession carried the weight of history and the responsibility of preservation for future generations. She had told the boy that they were not owners of these treasures, but merely custodians entrusted with their care. Those words echoed in James's mind now with devastating clarity. The Queen had always viewed herself as a steward of the crown's legacy, never as its proprietor. She understood that her personal effects, especially items of significance like her Medal of Honor, belonged not just to her, but to the nation and its history. The thought that someone could so casually dispose of these irreplaceable artifacts filled James with a fury that burned like molten metal in his chest. During his brief break between shifts, James retreated to the guards' quarters where he sat alone staring at his hands. These same hands had saluted the Queen thousands of times, had stood ready to defend her life without question, had sworn sacred oaths to protect the crown and all it represented. Now they felt useless, powerless to prevent what felt like a systematic dismantling of everything he had devoted his life to protecting. His fellow guards noticed his unusual demeanor, but James found himself unable to share what he had witnessed. The code of silence that governed palace staff was absolute, and breaking it would mean the end of his career and possibly legal consequences. Yet remaining silent felt like complicity in something that violated every principle he held sacred. The internal conflict tore at him like a physical wound, making it difficult to concentrate on even the most routine aspects of his duties. That night, James lay awake in his modest apartment, staring at the ceiling as images from the day replayed endlessly in his mind. He thought about his grandfather's war medals, carefully preserved in a display case that held the place of honor in his family's modest home. Those medals represented sacrifices made for country and crown, and the idea of selling them to strangers would have been unthinkable to his family. Yet here was someone in the highest echelons of the royal household, treating the Queen's most precious possessions as disposable assets. The next morning brought no relief from James's torment. As he took his position at the palace gates, he noticed unusual activity that suggested more visitors were expected. His worst fears were confirmed when he saw Marcus Whitfield returning, this time accompanied by two other individuals who carried themselves with the confident air of people accustomed to handling valuable objects. The sight of them approaching the palace entrance made James feel physically sick. This time, the transaction was even more brazen. Camilla led the group to a private sitting room whose windows faced the courtyard where James stood guard. Through the tall windows, he could see multiple items being displayed and examined. Jewelry that he recognized from official portraits, personal effects that had been gifts from world leaders, and items that represented decades of the Queen's service to her. People were being evaluated for their resale value. James watched in horror as a pearl necklace that the Queen had worn during her coronation was held up to the light and discussed in terms of carats and current market prices for natural pearls. A collection of military insignia, gifts from various Commonwealth nations, were examined and sorted as if they were inventory in a warehouse rather than symbols of international relationships built over a lifetime of diplomatic service. The casual manner in which these irreplaceable artifacts were being handled filled James with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his professional training. He found himself taking deeper breaths, focusing on his military discipline to prevent himself from abandoning his post and confronting the people who were systematically dismantling the Queen's legacy. The internal struggle between duty and conscience became almost unbearable as he watched item after item disappear into velvet-lined cases, destined for private collections. Marcus Whitfield seemed particularly interested in a small collection of personal photographs that included images of the Queen with various heads of state throughout her reign. James knew these photographs held immense historical value beyond their monetary worth, representing relationships and moments that had shaped the modern Commonwealth. The thought of them ending up in some private collector's vault, hidden from public view forever, made him feel as though he was witnessing the theft of history itself. As the afternoon transaction concluded, James noticed that the participants were becoming more confident, less concerned about discretion. They discussed upcoming opportunities and made plans for regular evaluations of additional items. It became clear that this was not merely the disposal of a few excess possessions, but a systematic liquidation of the Queen's personal effects for private gain. The scope of what was being lost to the nation became more apparent with each passing hour. The weight of his knowledge grew heavier with each transaction James witnessed. He began to understand that his position as a silent guardian placed him in a unique position to document these activities, but the question of what to do with that knowledge tormented him. His oath required silence, but his conscience demanded action. The conflict between these two imperatives would soon reach a breaking point that would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since James first witnessed the sale of the Queen's Medal of Honor, and the pattern had become sickeningly routine. Every few days, Marcus Whitfield or his associates would arrive at the palace with their leather portfolios and velvet-lined cases, leaving with pieces of history that would never again serve the purpose for which they were intended. James had become an unwilling expert in recognizing the signs that preceded these transactions, and each one felt like another blow to his faith in the institution he had sworn to protect. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday morning when James watched as a group of items was prepared for what appeared to be the largest transaction yet. Among the pieces being evaluated was a ceremonial sword that had been presented to the Queen by the Scottish Regiment, an organization with which James's own family had deep connections. His grandfather had served with distinction in that very regiment, and James remembered the pride in the old man's voice when he spoke about the honor of presenting gifts to the crown. As James watched, Marcus Whitfield examined the sword's intricate engravings and tested its balance. Something fundamental shifted inside him. This was no longer just about preserving artifacts. It was about preserving the memory and sacrifices of countless individuals who had served their country with honor. The sword represented a bond between the crown and its people, a symbol of mutual respect and dedication that was being severed for the sake of monetary gain. The transaction proceeded with the same casual efficiency that James had come to despise. Papers were signed, money changed hands, and another piece of the nation's heritage disappeared into private ownership. But this time, James noticed something different in Camilla's demeanor. She seemed hurried, almost nervous, glancing frequently toward the palace windows as if concerned about being observed. Her conversation with Marcus Whitfield included hushed discussions about discretion and timing that suggested she was aware that her actions might not withstand public scrutiny. During his lunch break, James made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He retrieved a small digital camera from his personal belongings, a device he had purchased years ago to document family gatherings, but had never imagined using in his professional capacity. The weight of the camera in his hands felt enormous, representing as it did a complete abandonment of the code of silence that had governed his entire career. Returning to his post, James positioned himself strategically to document the next transaction. His hands shook slightly as he prepared to cross a line from which there would be no return. 23 years of unwavering loyalty to the crown warred with his growing conviction that true loyalty sometimes required difficult choices. As he watched another priceless artifact being reduced to a commodity, James realized that his silence had become complicity in something that betrayed everything the Queen had stood for. The camera's quiet click seemed to echo like thunder in James's ears as he captured images of items being examined, papers being signed, and money being exchanged. Each photograph felt like an act of rebellion against his training, yet also like a fulfillment of his deeper duty to protect the integrity of the crown. He was no longer just a silent guardian. He was becoming a witness in the truest sense of the word. Over the following days, James documented transaction after transaction with growing efficiency. He learned to anticipate the best angles, to capture clear images of the items being sold, and to photograph the documents that accompanied each sale. His training in observation and attention to detail, skills that had made him an excellent guard, now served him in this very different capacity. The evidence he was gathering painted a picture of systematic disposal that went far beyond what could be justified as routine estate management. The stress of maintaining his double life began to take its toll on James. His fellow guards noticed his increasing tension, the way he seemed to be constantly alert even during supposedly relaxed moments. Sleep became elusive as his mind raced through the implications of what he was documenting and the potential consequences of his actions. He found himself questioning not just Camilla's behavior, but his own role in remaining silent for so long. One evening, as James reviewed the photographs he had taken, the full scope of what was being lost became devastatingly clear. Items that represented decades of international diplomacy, symbols of military service and national pride, personal mementos that connected the current reign to centuries of royal history, all were being scattered to private collectors who would likely never understand their true significance. The cultural and historical loss was immeasurable, but seemed to matter little compared to the immediate financial gain being realized. James began to research the legal and ethical implications of what he was witnessing. Late at night in the privacy of his apartment, he scoured government websites and legal databases, trying to understand whether there were laws being broken or merely traditions being violated. What he discovered filled him with even greater outrage. Many of the items being sold were likely held in trust for the nation, meaning that their disposal required proper authorization and documentation that he had seen no evidence of. The realization that he might be witnessing not just ethical violations but potentially criminal activity added urgency to James's documentation efforts. He began to focus not just on the items being sold, but on the people involved, the paperwork being signed, and the money changing hands. His photographs became more systematic, more comprehensive, as he built what was essentially a case file that could potentially be used to expose the full extent of what was happening within the palace walls. As another week passed, James noticed that the frequency of transactions was increasing. It seemed as though there was pressure to dispose of as many items as possible within a certain time frame, possibly before someone in authority might notice what was happening. The urgency with which Marcus Whitfield and his associates were working suggested that they too understood that their window of opportunity might not remain open indefinitely. For James, this acceleration meant that his moment of decision was rapidly approaching. The moment that would define the rest of James's life came on a cold Thursday morning, when he witnessed something that shattered his last vestige of restraint. Among the items being prepared for sale was a small wooden box that he recognized immediately, though he had only seen it once before during his years of service. It was the Queen's private jewelry box, a simple walnut case that she had kept on her bedside table and used to store her most personally significant pieces, items that held sentimental rather than monetary value. James remembered the day he had glimpsed this box during a security sweep of the royal quarters. The Queen had been present, and she had noticed his inadvertent glance toward the modest container. Rather than reprimanding him, she had smiled gently and explained that it contained treasures that money cannot buy, pieces given to her by her children, Gifts from dear friends and simple jewelry that held memories rather than impressive gemstones. The reverence in her voice when she spoke of these humble items had moved James deeply. Now he watched in absolute horror as Camilla opened this sacred container and began sorting through its contents with Marcus Whitfield, dismissing some pieces as too sentimental to have market value, while setting others aside for potential sale. The casual way she handled these deeply personal items, pieces that had brought the Queen comfort during her most private moments, represented a violation so profound that James felt physically ill. Among the items being evaluated was a simple silver locket that James had seen the Queen touch unconsciously during moments of stress or sadness. Inside that locket, he knew, was a photograph of her late husband during their early marriage, a treasure that no amount of money could adequately compensate for. The thought of this intimate memento ending up in some stranger's collection, separated forever from its intended purpose, filled James with a rage that burned like acid in his veins. As Marcus Whitfield examined the locket through his jeweler's loupe and discussed its modest but sellable value, James felt something fundamental break inside him. 23 years of discipline, training, and professional restraint crumbled in the face of this ultimate desecration. His hands trembled as he raised his camera one final time, capturing images not just of the transaction, but of the complete violation of trust and memory that was taking place before his eyes. The photograph of Marcus Whitfield holding the Queen's most precious locket would later become the centerpiece of James's evidence, a single image that encapsulated the entire scope of what was being lost. In that moment, as the camera's shutter clicked, James Mitchell ceased to be a silent guardian and became something else entirely, a protector of memory and legacy, who would no longer be bound by codes of silence that enabled such violations. The rest of the transaction passed in a blur for James. He documented everything mechanically, his emotional numbness allowing him to focus entirely on gathering evidence. When Camilla and her associates finally departed, taking with them another piece of the Queen's soul, James remained at his post but began planning his next steps. The time for passive observation had ended. The moment for action had arrived. That evening, James sat in his apartment surrounded by printed photographs that told a story of systematic betrayal and cultural vandalism. The images were damning in their clarity, showing not just individual transactions but a pattern of behavior that revealed the true scope of what was happening. He had documented the sale of military honors, diplomatic gifts, personal jewelry, historical artifacts, and now the most intimate mementos of a woman who had devoted her life to serving her people. James spent the night researching his options, understanding that once he chose to break his silence, there would be no going back. His career would end, his pension would likely be forfeit, and he would face the possibility of legal action for violating his confidentiality agreements. Yet the alternative, remaining silent while the Queen's legacy was sold piece by piece to the highest bidder, had become unthinkable. He considered various approaches, contacting journalists who covered royal affairs, reaching out to members of Parliament who might be able to initiate investigations, or even attempting to work within the palace hierarchy to report what he had witnessed. Each option carried significant risks, but James realized that his oath to protect the crown extended beyond protecting the physical safety of its current occupants. Sometimes true loyalty required the courage to expose betrayal, even when that betrayal came from within. As dawn approached, James made his decision. He would compile his evidence into a comprehensive dossier that told the complete story of what he had witnessed. The photographs would be organized chronologically, showing the progression from isolated transactions to systematic liquidation. He would include detailed notes about dates, times, people involved, and items sold, creating a record that could not be dismissed or ignored. The weight of his decision settled over James like a heavy blanket, bringing with it both relief and terror. Relief that he would no longer be complicit in what he had witnessed, and terror at the consequences he would face for speaking truth to power. But as he looked at the photographs spread across his kitchen table, particularly the image of the Queen's locket being evaluated like any other commodity, James knew he had no choice. His patience had finally broken, shattered by the accumulation of violations he had witnessed and the ultimate desecration of the Queen's most personal possessions. The loyal guard who had stood silent for 23 years was about to find his voice, and when he spoke, The revelation would shake the very foundations of the institution he had spent his life protecting. The transformation from guardian to whistleblower was complete, and James Mitchell was ready to face whatever consequences awaited him for choosing conscience over compliance. James spent 3 sleepless nights organizing his evidence into a comprehensive dossier that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. He arranged the photographs chronologically, creating a timeline that showed the escalation from occasional transactions to systematic liquidation of the Queen's estate. Each image was accompanied by detailed notes documenting the date, time, participants, and items involved. The completed file painted a devastating picture of betrayal that reached the highest levels of the royal household. The decision of whom to contact with his explosive evidence proved agonizing. James understood that once he released this information, it would trigger a media storm that would consume not just those directly involved, but potentially damage the entire monarchy. Yet his conscience would no longer allow him to remain silent while the Queen's legacy was sold to private collectors, who would never understand the true significance of what they were purchasing. After careful consideration, James decided to approach Victoria Pemberton, a veteran journalist known for her integrity and careful handling of sensitive royal stories. Unlike tabloid reporters who sensationalized palace gossip, Victoria had built her reputation on thorough research and responsible reporting. If anyone could handle this story with the gravity it deserved, it would be her. James made contact through an encrypted email account, requesting a private meeting to discuss matters of urgent national importance regarding the Crown estate. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe in a London suburb, far from the usual haunts of royal correspondents and palace insiders. James arrived carrying a nondescript briefcase that contained copies of his evidence, his hands trembling slightly as he spotted Victoria at a corner table. She was a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and an air of professional competence that immediately put James at ease. When he explained who he was and why he had requested the meeting, her expression shifted from curiosity to intense focus. Victoria listened in stunned silence as James walked her through his evidence, photograph by photograph. Her experienced eye immediately recognized the significance of what she was seeing, and her questions demonstrated a deep understanding of royal protocol and the legal implications of unauthorized disposal of crown property. When James showed her the image of the Queen's personal locket being evaluated for sale, Victoria's composure momentarily cracked, and James saw tears forming in her eyes. The journalist spent nearly 3 hours reviewing James's documentation, taking careful notes and asking probing questions about his observations. She was particularly interested in the timeline showing the acceleration of sales and the systematic nature of the operation. When James explained his concerns about the legal status of many items being sold, Victoria nodded grimly, indicating that she shared his suspicions about potential criminal activity. Victoria promised James that she would investigate his allegations thoroughly before publishing anything, understanding the explosive nature of the evidence and the need for absolute accuracy. She explained that her newspaper would need to verify the authenticity of the photographs and conduct independent research into the legal ownership of the items being sold. The process would take time, but it would ensure that when the story broke, it would be unassailable in its facts and devastating in its implications. Over the following weeks, Victoria's investigation expanded beyond James's evidence. She discovered that several of the items he had documented were already appearing in private auction houses and exclusive dealer catalogs, confirming that the sales were indeed reaching the open market. Her contacts in the art and antiques world provided additional details about the scope of royal items being offered for sale, painting a picture even more extensive than what James had witnessed firsthand. The legal research proved particularly damning. Victoria's team discovered that many of the items being sold were held in trust for the nation, meaning their disposal required specific authorization and documentation that had apparently never been obtained. Furthermore, several pieces had been gifted to the Queen in her official capacity as head of state, making them arguably property of the Crown, rather than personal possessions that could be freely disposed of. As the investigation progressed, James continued his duties at the palace, though the stress of his double life was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. His fellow guards noticed his tension, and his superiors began questioning his focus and dedication. The irony was devastating. His absolute dedication to protecting the crown was being interpreted as declining performance, because he could no longer maintain the facade of ignorant compliance. Victoria kept James informed of her progress through secure communications, and her updates revealed an increasingly complex web of unauthorized sales and questionable transactions. The evidence suggested that the disposal of the Queen's Medal of Honor was just the tip of an iceberg that included hundreds of items ranging from personal jewelry to official state gifts from foreign dignitaries. The scope of the cultural and historical loss was staggering. The breakthrough came when Victoria's investigation uncovered financial records showing large deposits into personal accounts that coincided with the dates of major transactions James had documented. The paper trail provided concrete evidence of personal enrichment from the sale of items that should have been preserved for the nation. What had begun as suspected ethical violations had evolved into evidence of potential criminal activity involving fraud and theft of public property. As Victoria prepared to publish her exposé, she met with James one final time to review the story and ensure accuracy. The article would name names, include photographic evidence, and detail the full scope of what had been discovered. James understood that publication would immediately identify him as the source, ending his career and potentially exposing him to legal retaliation. Yet as he read Victoria's carefully crafted article, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The headline would read, "Royal Guard Breaks Silence, Evidence of Systematic Sale of Queen's Personal Legacy." The story would include James's photographs, timeline of events, and detailed analysis of the legal implications. Most importantly, it would honor the memory of the Queen by exposing those who had betrayed her trust and violated the sacred responsibility of preserving her legacy for future generations. As James prepared for the storm that would follow publication, he reflected on the oath he had taken 23 years earlier. He had sworn to protect the crown, and sometimes protection required difficult choices. His patience had finally broken, but in breaking, it had revealed a strength he never knew he possessed: the courage to speak truth regardless of personal cost. The story broke on a Tuesday morning that would forever change the landscape of the British monarchy. Victoria Pemberton's explosive exposé dominated the front page of The Guardian under the headline, "The Crown Betrayed. Royal Guard Exposes Sale of Queen's Sacred Legacy." Within hours, the story had spread across every major news outlet in Britain and beyond, with James's meticulously documented evidence serving as undeniable proof of what many would later call the greatest betrayal in modern royal history. James was at his post when the first wave of media attention hit the palace. He watched through the gates as reporters and photographers gathered in unprecedented numbers, their voices carrying questions that would soon demand answers from the highest levels of the royal household. His mobile phone, which he had turned off hours earlier, vibrated constantly with calls from journalists seeking comment. The moment he had dreaded and anticipated had finally arrived. By midday, James received the summons he knew was inevitable. Palace security escorted him to an office where senior officials waited with expressions of barely controlled fury. His immediate dismissal was delivered with cold efficiency, accompanied by threats of legal action for breach of confidentiality and violation of his oath of service. James listened in silence, understanding that these consequences were the price he had always known he would pay for choosing conscience over compliance. The public reaction to Victoria's story exceeded even James's expectations. Social media exploded with outrage as people shared images of the Queen's Medal of Honor and personal effects being treated as mere commodities. The hashtag, Save the Queen's Legacy, began trending within hours, with citizens expressing their fury at the systematic disposal of artifacts that belonged to the nation's collective memory. Protesters gathered outside Buckingham Palace carrying signs demanding the return of sold items and accountability for those responsible. Parliamentary response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours of publication, members from across party lines called for immediate investigations into the unauthorized disposal of Crown property. The Attorney General announced that criminal investigations would be launched to determine whether fraud, theft, or conspiracy charges were warranted. Several MPs demanded emergency debates about the governance and oversight of royal estates to prevent future violations. Marcus Whitfield's auction house was raided by police on Wednesday morning, With officers seizing records and recovering several items that had not yet been sold to final purchasers, the investigation revealed a sophisticated network of dealers and collectors who had been systematically acquiring royal artifacts through what they claimed were legitimate channels. Many buyers, upon learning the true circumstances of their acquisitions, voluntarily returned items to Crown custody. Camilla's position became untenable as evidence mounted of her central role in orchestrating the sales. Legal experts analyzed her authority to dispose of the Queen's personal effects and concluded that many transactions exceeded her legitimate powers. Public calls for her removal from all royal duties grew louder, as more details emerged about the scope and systematic nature of the disposal operation. The palace's initial attempts to defend her actions as estate management collapsed under scrutiny. James, meanwhile, found himself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight as his identity as the whistleblowing guard became public knowledge. Despite losing his career and facing legal threats, he received overwhelming support from the public, veterans organizations, and fellow service members who praised his courage in protecting the Queen's memory. A crowdfunding campaign to support his legal defense raised hundreds of thousands of pounds within days, demonstrating the public's appreciation for his sacrifice. The investigation's findings, released 6 months later, confirmed James's worst fears about the scope of the unauthorized sales. Over 300 items of significant historical and cultural value had been disposed of without proper authorization, generating millions of pounds in proceeds that had been improperly retained by individuals, rather than benefiting the Crown estate. The report recommended criminal charges against several participants and sweeping reforms to prevent future violations. Most satisfying to James was the successful recovery of the Queen's Medal of Honor, which was traced to a private collector in Switzerland, who immediately returned it upon learning of its stolen status. The medal was restored to its rightful place in the Crown's collection, where it would be preserved for future generations to understand and appreciate the Queen's legacy of service and sacrifice. The long-term consequences of James's courage extended far beyond the immediate scandal. New legislation established stronger oversight of royal estates, with independent auditors and parliamentary committees ensuring that items of national significance could never again be casually disposed of for personal gain. The Queen's personal effects were designated as protected heritage artifacts, requiring formal approval and public documentation for any future disposals. James eventually found new purpose, working with heritage organizations to identify and recover stolen royal artifacts that had entered the black market over the decades. His expertise in recognizing significant items and understanding palace protocols made him invaluable in efforts to preserve Britain's cultural legacy. Though his career as a royal guard had ended, his service to the Crown continued in a different but equally important capacity. Years later, as James walked through the newly established Queen Elizabeth Memorial Gallery, where many of the recovered items were displayed for public viewing, he reflected on the moment when his patience had finally broken. The Queen's Medal of Honor occupied the place of honor in the central display case, its inscription catching the light as visitors read about its significance and the woman who had worn it with such pride. In choosing to break his silence, James had ensured that future generations would understand not just what the Queen had accomplished, but what she had truly meant to represent. The guard who had once stood silent had found his voice at the moment when it mattered most, and in doing so, had protected something far more valuable than any individual life: the integrity of an institution and the preservation of a legacy that belonged to all people. His patience had broken, but in breaking it had revealed the unbreakable strength of those who choose principle over personal safety when the stakes are highest.